put up with me because I like to sort of wander around. I like to see your faces. You've already learned more about me than a lot of people know, and it's absolutely positively true. For the past 10 years, I have been married to someone who was, for the first 5 years of our marriage, a deputy chief with the LAPD. I now refer to him as being in recovery. At the same time, I have been working extensively with Homeboy Industries, as Jeff just spoke about, and my brother said, if I could ever have dreamt my sister would be married to a cop and working with a priest, I would have said someone is lying. So, I have worked with gangs, been involved with gangs, tried to figure out about gangs for 34 years. I began as a young social worker in South Los Angeles in some of the most gang-infested housing projects that are now almost mythic. Jordan Downs, Nickerson Gardens, Imperial Courts. And I worked in these projects during what is now referred to as the decade of death, when crack and unregulated gun availability laid waste to communities of color. In Los Angeles, during the late 1980s and early 1990s, there were 1,000 plus homicides a year in the city of Los Angeles, not the county, the city. Nowadays, we are hovering somewhere between 200 and 300 homicides a year. And people talk about the gang problem having been addressed. Yes and no. And I want to share with you what I have experienced, what I have learned, but I've got to give you a proviso. I am not a typical academic. I am not going to sit here and quote statistics to you or talk to you about theory. I am going to talk with you about practicalities. I am going to talk to you about pragmatic approaches, and I am going to talk about reality. Because San Francisco, just like Los Angeles learned, will never, ever solve or deal with its gang problem effectively unless there is true collaboration. And I'm going to talk to you about what that looks like and what that feels like and what that means. And I'm going to speak to you about the lessons that have been learned as law enforcement had to come off its high perch, and I don't know if that's true in San Francisco, but in Los Angeles, law enforcement learned to its great fortune that collaboration truly is the answer. And I'm going to talk with you about some of the lessons learned. First and foremost, I can tell you that the people we have learned lessons from have been gang members themselves. My research is engaged with talking with both current active gang members and former gang members. I work to collect their life histories. We have now collected over 300 life histories, and still the stories do not talk. They do not stop. What do we learn about people in gangs? I recall early on when I was sitting down with someone whose gang name was Smiley. His real name was Erwin Panamero. He is written about in my book. And Smiley was a young man of 19 when I first sat down with him at Homeboy Industries. And one of the things he said to me plaintively was, why was no one there for me? Why did no one speak to me? Why did no one try to stop me? Smiley was arrested when he was 16 years old. His big homie told him to lie about his age and say he was 18 because they could be together in jail. And from there, his story unfolded. There were different social interventions, different things were done with him, and ultimately, Smiley was helped. but his words haunted me. Why did no one speak to me? Why did no one try to stop me? And I began to listen to the stories of gang members and former gang members, and my research team at UCLA discovered some startling truths. Gang members do leave the gang, and they leave the gang for a variety of reasons. They all have a turning point when they decide to leave that changes them. The turning point would be something any of you would logically imagine. For female gang members, and by the way, we didn't see many of them on that video, but they are out there. And they are not baby mamas, they are active gang members. For female gang members, the turning point most often came with the birth of a child. For male gang members, the picture is much more complex. It might be, surprisingly, because I'm not a big fan of the law, it might be because they got their second strike and they're frightened of getting the third. It might be because of the birth of a child, usually a son. Somehow, the gang world has not quite caught up with post-feminist theory. Or it might be like the story a gang member named Maniac told me when he decided to leave the rolling 60s after 20 years and after achieving shot caller status. He was in the back seat of a car, being driven by one of his underlings in the front seat. And one of his fellow gang associates got in the back seat with him. And the associate said, "Move over." And Maniac didn't want to move over. The associate said, "Move over." Maniac didn't want to move over. The associate shoved him over, and about 10 seconds later, a gun was shot, a bullet came through the back of the car, pierced the associate through the neck, and killed him instantly. And Maniac said, "Had the guy not shoved me aside, I would be dead. I'm done." That was his turning point. Now, call it a turning point, call it a teachable moment, use whatever terminology you want. That is the point we need to be present. And when I say we, I mean we. At that moment, at that turning point, at that moment of truth, at that teachable moment, it is imperative that resources be brought to bear. Now, what are the two most impressive resources that are brought to bear at that moment? There are two major forces that help gang members change. One is tattoo removal. Tattoo removal is the first major force. It is the denunciation of an identity. The second is legal assistance and legal expungements. It's surprising. You didn't see it on the video. I never thought of it. The first thing individuals need not to feel like gang members is to erase their past. They erase it literally. They've talked with me about feeling like it was a baptism. Removing their tattoos, legal expungements. But it's not that simple. Changing from being a gang member to a former gang member involves a change in identity. And that's a tricky, tricky process. It is slow, it is steady, it is fraught with frustration. The gang is most commonly replaced with drugs. There are also fallbacks, relapses, connections with homies. There are struggles. And this is where collaboration needs to take hold. It has now become a cliche to say we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. I am tired of those words. I no longer want to hear those words. And that is not to give law enforcement short shrift. I can tell you categorically, I have had an impact on my husband's life, some of it unwanted, and yet he has had an impact on mine. And I have done extensive work with law enforcement, both with the LAPD and with the Los Angeles County Sheriff. And I am here to tell you that crime has been driven down in Los Angeles because of their efforts, but not only because of their efforts. So, what does the collaboration look like? I want you to keep some ideas in mind. First of all, there is no first among equals. What we learned in Los Angeles was suppression alone was absolutely not the answer. It didn't work. There were record highs in gang violence in 2005. You saw that in the video. I want to tell you what's happened between 2005 and 2012. Number one, the grassroots, the disorganized, fragmented, passionate grassroots must be part of the effort. The community members who go to county supervisors' meetings, the community members who pass out flyers, the youth who have been in the juvenile justice system that are now part of youth justice coalitions, those individuals must have a seat at the table, number one. Number two, community-based organizations that operate on a shoestring and often without any kind of coverage anywhere at all, must be legitimized and made part of the conversation. I have witnessed this with Homeboy Industries. How many people in the audience have heard of Homeboy Industries? Okay. In California, I rarely have to worry. I speak cross-country, and sometimes I'll get to a state like I was in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I started to talk about Father Greg Boyle, and no one had any idea what I was talking about. Now, I've known Greg Boyle for 25 years. I worked with him when he routinely received calls with death threats because people believed he was trying to help gang members. The LAPD used to call him a thug hugger, and that was the lightest name they called him. I'm not going to repeat everything they have said, not because I'm afraid of using profanity, but because it was a different LAPD. He was seen, it was rumored that the Mexican mafia was allowed to meet in his church. It was rumored that he held guns for gang members. It was rumored that he was helping gang members cross the border and evade arrest. I'm sure he knew where the body of Jimmy Hoffa was buried by the time you got done listening to the rumors. Nowadays, the LAPD views Homeboy Industries as integral to its anti-gang efforts. Not all of them, not 9,000 members, but I can tell you this. When Homeboy Industries had its annual benefit to honor people in the community as well as former gang members, the person they honored was Chief Charlie Beck, the chief of the LAPD. And lest you think that was an anomaly, the year before, they honored Sheriff Lee Baca. There is an alliance between community-based organizations and law enforcement. That's not enough. There has also been, in the streets, ongoing, a relationship a tricky one, a delicate one, a thoughtful one between the Los Angeles Police Department and gang intervention. Why is it tricky? Because interventionists are former gang members, and they have to be very careful about how they play out their relationship. They do not want to be known as snitches, and yet they want to stop the bleeding. I cannot tell you the complete shock I have felt as I have sat down with veteran members of the LAPD staff, and they have talked about the important work of gang interventionists. This is not lip service, this is reality. And then I bring us to the most important part of collaboration. It has to do with helping young people, whether they are at risk of joining gangs or they want to leave gangs. Either one, they need help building their identities. They need help with seeing an alternative to gang life. They need someone who is interested in them. I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to talk about who those people are. When I was a sweet young thing and a social worker in Nickerson Gardens, I had that one kid. Every single public defender, every gang interventionist, every prosecutor, every person in this room knows about that one kid. All of us have that kid. They touch us. They touch us for reasons we cannot articulate. I don't know why Bobby touched me. His name was Little Devil, but I never wanted to call him by that name, although when I think about my personality, that may in fact be the exact reason why he touched me. But he affected me. He was 14 years old. He had been abused. He was in foster placement with his aunt in Nickerson Gardens. And I had to go visit him. And I fell in love with him in the most proper, loving, maternal, big sister way. I loved him. And I would say to him, with all the zealotry and ignorance of a young social worker, I'll always be here for you. Always. I'll always be here for you. Now, it was a Friday night. I had gone on what was one in a string of many disastrous dates. This is back in the 1980s when people still dated. We did not yet hook up. Or we did, but we didn't say we hooked up. And it was about 2 in the morning, and I was getting home. And I lived in an old wood frame house in Venice, California. I'm sure everybody here has heard of Venice. It was a funky house. The rent was affordable, but it was 2 in the morning. And the house had a wraparound porch. And I was walking up to my house. There was no garage, parked on the street, walked up to the house, and there was a shadowy figure on the porch. So I did what any God-fearing young woman did in the 80s. I unzipped my purse, reached for my can of mace. Yes, I had taken the training. I was prepared, and I looked at the shadowy figure, and he said, "Jorja," and I heard the voice, and I knew it was Bobby. And I, with all the sensitivity of a newly minted social worker, said, "What the fuck are you doing here?" And he spilled out a story that his foster uncle, his uncle, worked at Martin Luther King Hospital, where I was a social worker. He managed to convince his uncle to break into my personnel file. No computers there, only hard copies. He got my personnel file. He got my address. There's no public transportation in Los Angeles. Not now, not then. There's no BART, no nothing. He took 3 buses and hitchhiked and made it to my old frame house in Venice. And I said, "Why are you here?" And he said, "I was in a car. We did a drive-by. I don't know what to do. You said you would always be there for me." Now there's the answer, and there's the question. How are we always going to be there for Bobby? How are we going to help young people at risk or young people who are active build new identities? We begin with tattoo removal. We begin with legal expungements, and we work on attachment. Every individual who wants to avoid being in a gang, who wants to leave a gang, needs a role model, needs a mentor, needs someone to kick their ass, needs someone to be there. And let me tell you, there is no one type of person. We need the merging of former gang members, of prosecutors, of social workers, of public defenders. You have all had that kid. That kid needs role models, they need job training, and they need real jobs. Yes, I was heartened to hear that in the video. Nothing stops a bullet like a job. And we need to provide them. Bobby did not ask for his fate. Smiley did not ask for his fate. Young woman I work with, dark eyes, who has 5 children and has been a member of Florencia 13 and finally wants to leave the gang. She did not ask for her fate. We need to be there for them. We need to listen to what their needs are. We need to provide them with jobs. And dear God, law enforcement and the community and the grassroots need to merge. You cannot meet. You need to collaborate. You cannot just speak to one another. You need to talk together. That is our challenge. And I want to urge everyone in the audience, just like myself, I take strength from those words, from that question, as Bobby threw down the gauntlet to me 30 years ago. You said you would always be there for me. We need to be there in force, together, with understanding. Thank you so much.